All right. So here we are back with the Rubin special. I'm Josh Rubin here in New York with my good friend Jonathan Miller, who is joining us live from his house. I'm comfortably safe in mine. And I have good news for you guys. Unlike the last 3 days of the Rubin special, Jonathan shares something in common with me in that he and I both have pants on. So Jonathan, thank you for that. You know, you're a busy guy these days. There's a lot of media outlets that really want to bring their viewers certainty, and so that's something that we as a society crave in a highly uncertain time, incredibly volatile environment. Of course, we want to give a huge thanks to our soldiers on the front line in the form of our medical professionals, doctors, nurses, administrators, and staff, and all the hospitals and medical institutions that are helping those that are infected with this silent enemy in the form of the coronavirus and COVID-19. So, Jonathan, I know it's come as a shock to us, and the end of the first quarter, and specifically March. We as a city in New York basically had to shut down.
Right.
But, there are things that are still going to contract. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the data?
Sure. So thanks for inviting me on, and I'm glad that everybody knows that we're wearing pants. I think that was important to sort of deal with that question first. In terms of our craving for information, it's also incumbent upon providers of information to not embellish, because we're in this really rare moment where there's not a lot of data and there's not a lot of transparency on that data at this point. One of the characteristics of the first quarter of all the New York City metro area reports, and we complete about 35 different markets for Douglas Elliman across the country, and it's almost the same story, where the first quarter, the data going into the virus, the first 2.5 months of the respective first quarters showed an uptick. And I think that had a lot to do with mortgage rates. And, in the New York area, sellers slowly getting the message that the market had changed with all the the new tax programs and rent law and things that were sort of thrust into the market that maybe not in other parts of the country.
Right.
But the last 2 weeks of the quarter, the last 2 weeks of March, it's important to think of the market now with this demarcation line, sort of before and after the virus. So, or not before and after the virus, but before and after, where the virus became, unless you were living in a cave on a desert island, that there was full awareness. And I picked that as March 15th, which was the second Fed rate cut on a Sunday.
On a Sunday, not a turn. In other words, not a scheduled meeting.
Not a normal thing. And a friend of mine in California picked March 11th, which was the day Tom Hanks and his wife announced that they had the virus.
That was the
So the thinking here is that there's a 4-day sort of window, whatever it is, it's mid-March, but we're calling that period from Hanks to Banks. And and so the last 2 weeks was marked by a sharp drop in listing inventory, which inventory generally across almost every region we cover across the country, inventory's down. And it's unusual. It's unusual in the sense that typically inventory rises from year end to the end of the first quarter as people are gearing up for the spring market, which is, I call it the first hump of the 2-hump sort of annual sales camel.
Right.
And we're essentially not having a spring market now in the traditional sense because of the pragmatic nature of it. So anyway, that's sort of the context for like, what are we seeing? And so we're definitely hearing about and being told about contracts. However, what's really important to understand is that contracts, just like closings, are a lagging indicator. So contracts that the scenario, I don't have to tell you, Josh, you know better than me, but you're facilitating the negotiation between buyer and seller. If there's a broker on each side, they agree to price, the buyer and seller agree to price in general terms, and then it goes to the attorneys. And then it could be there for 2 to 4 weeks. And so and then the contracts are signed. So we look at pending data. Pending data can lag the actual meeting of the minds between buyer and seller for a month. And so, and I would think that, when you talk about 2 to 4 weeks, the 4 is the more normal now post this COVID demarcation, simply because people are being extra cautious for good reason.
Yeah.
So anyway, to answer your question, you need data. And I always say the plural of anecdotal is not data. And we have tons of anecdotal data. And so the first sort of issue here is, yes, we are hearing about contracts being signed, but it's more on the margin. It's not mainstream like business as usual, right?
Right. Absolutely.
The other thing that we're seeing is, that I think what I'm asked every single time I speak is, well, how much is the market down, right? Everybody wants that one number and say, boom, and we have past history. We have 9/11, Lehman, we have Superstorm Sandy, and then you have, is it a studio? Is it a 5-bedroom penthouse, right? So you have all this stuff, and everybody wants one number to sort of pigeonhole. This is the number.
They want to know that the market's down X%, right?
Exactly. On an anecdotal level, we're seeing it all over the place. We're seeing no discounts. We're seeing we're also seeing 5 to 15%, and I've seen one that was around 25-ish%.
Now, when you define these discounts,
these people are people that signed pre-COVID, and every closing attorney, the conversation they have with the sellers is the sellers are trying to keep the buyers, and some are offering to go lower on the agreed upon price, and every buyer is either trying to cut the strings and leave, or get a better deal. But
so are these people that are sort of past their contingencies?
It's coming close.
Yeah.
So what we're having now is this discovery period where I'd call it price discovery, which just because everybody's trying to sort of understand. What's very different now is that even though we've sort of defined a specific start date for full situational awareness, there's no end date.
That being the banks, the
Hanks to banks. And so there's no end date. In other words, and to be very callous and superficial, on 9/11, there was a 9/12, a 9/13, a 9/14, and every day you get away from the event, there was light at the end of the tunnel, and you were better able to process the catastrophe or the event. Same thing with Lehman. Generally there was a cluster of problems. I mean, cluster of bailouts like AIG and Fannie and Freddie, and all sorts of problems, but it was more of a specific moment, and you knew that the further you got away, that there would be some sort of fix, or things would get better.
Yeah.
This one, we don't have that, although we're getting close. In other words, everything we're reading, we're sort of at or past the apex of the virus. And that means we start thinking about, things reopening. The problem I have, or not the problem I have, but the concern of going forward is that You think of the devastation of small businesses to, you know, everybody, independent contractors, employees being laid off, everybody, and all the government money that's sort of coming in to try to help everybody last another couple of months. My concern is that we come back too soon, and then we go through this all over again. And
Yeah.
and so that
Are you speaking specifically to New York City, New York State, the tri-state, or are you
yes,
more so
I'm
along the
speaking.
lines of Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, these states that are sort of opening up because they haven't had that many cases?
Right. And listen, I have appraiser colleagues around the country, friend of mine in Texas, where there's although it's funny, everybody's saying, well, there's very few cases. Well, it's because they're not testing, right? So the focus for me is really New York City Metro because I'm here. And so I'm concerned. We have a proactive governor, and so I'm not concerned about that. I'm just more concerned about people just being cooped up and then just running out. Sort of the way I think of it is the longer we shelter in place, the faster the housing market recovers, which is sort of, it's logical because the shorter the period of the virus, the less economic damage there will be, therefore the less damage to the housing market. We don't just pick up where we left off.
Right.
And actually one of the points I was making about the first quarter results across most of the markets is that generally there was, either an improved market or it was less weak than it was last year. So, generally things were better. So the theory is, well, if it's better, then therefore you're better equipped going into the virus than if it was a terrible, devastated market already going into this virus. So when you come out on the other side, the thinking based on no analytics whatsoever, just logic that you're in a better place, even though that place will not be as good as where we entered.
Do you think that there's any situation where we come back and say, June plus or minus, and things are, as far as values are concerned, more or less the same as where we left off, or better?
So my thinking is from a value standpoint, just looking at it logically without the benefit of a lot of data yet,
Yeah.
is that the concern I have, and this is what happened after SALT as well,
Right.
is that it
That's
takes
the elimination of the state and local tax deduction.
exactly, which when growing up, I thought that stood for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. But
It's easy to get those two confused.
Yeah, but it's become state and local taxes. The concern I have, so I'm thinking like by the time we hit, maybe just before 4th of July, we'll be out and about with masks on, but, moving around and,
Sure.
there'll be still social distancing and all that. And so you have pent up demand from the spring, but you have two types of pent up demand. You have the pent up demand of the buyer who, is looking at record low mortgage rates or near record low mortgage rates. They're first time buyers. They want to buy whatever, they're ready, but they were thwarted and they can't. But you also have pent up demand of would be sellers. It's really pent up supply. Where, hey, I wanted to list my house right now and I'm ready. And, these things are going on in my life that, when this is over, like I need to be somewhere else and I need to sell my house to do that. So I think whatever happens, we surgically remove the spring sales hump, so to speak, and we're going to kick that sort of can down the road to whenever that is. And my guess is it's not as soon as June. It's more later in the summer or, immediately after Labor Day. And then
then we're going, I think you're heading into this, then you go smack into the election.
Yes. which, we all need another variable to calculate in the housing market, right? Like if it wasn't complicated enough.
Yeah.
I did a short study earlier this year where I looked at, and this is just Manhattan, but I looked at uh, contract activity from 2008 to 2019 through the end of the year for even versus odd years. The even year being an election year, federal election year, including midterms, right?
Yeah.
So every 2 years there's a federal election, and then the odd years, and I compared them.
This
And it was
is going back
fast,
how far?
just to 2008, to the financial crisis.
Yeah.
So,
So about 10 years, give or take.
right, exactly. So essentially what happened was, and I did it by month. So it was a lot of data points. And essentially what it showed us is that beginning in the early summer, an election year, sales activity pauses or slows disproportionately to a non-election year. And it doesn't matter what period we're talking about, since 2008, what election, what politician, what party, what politics are, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
In the months leading up to election is a gradual slowdown in sales activity all the way through October, where it was about a little over 12%, where sales activity lagged non-election years by about 12%. But then November, December, January, and February, there's a massive release in pent-up demand, no matter what the party or politics of term, and it all washes out. In other words, you're just simply shifting, that pause or hesitation before the election, and then you double down after the election. I thought that was astounding. And so we have that sort of in the mix as well, where the summer traditionally, in election year, at least since 2008, we've seen a sort of seasonal slowdown because of the election in Manhattan specifically. I'm not speaking for other markets.
Right.
And sort of and then a massive release in November. Now think about that. If we surgically removed the spring market and lumped it on top of the fall market, and then you have this election factor on top of it, you could see, in sort of an intense level of activity, say October, November, especially November, sort of playing catch up with what had happened in the past.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, in terms of pricing, that remember that the supply is also going to go up like a rocket ship.
Right.
But demand will be above average as well.
Do we think that though demand will be enough to offset that supply? Because I've often said over the last few weeks in the conversations, and I've had hundreds of conversations with both my current, past clients, future prospect clients, as well as colleagues like yourself, that obviously we've hit a pause on all activity as far as New York City specifically is concerned. You'll hear trickles of activity coming from Eastern Long Island with people thinking about second homes, a little bit in Connecticut and a little bit in New Jersey. Obviously, the further away you get from the immediate, say, 30-mile radius of New York City, the more active the market is. And of course, I'm speaking to colleagues in places like, Texas and Tennessee and Florida. And while activity isn't what it should be, there's still some activity, whereas in New York City, we don't have much. So my point here, Jonathan, is, do you think that we're going to have this arbitrarily high level of supply between the people who, what was it you said, 67% of inventory came off the market or something like that?
Yes,
a couple of weeks ago.
Huge number. Yes.
Right. So that's a disproportionately high number of apartments that have come off the market. Of course, we might see things that had been listed 6 months ago that didn't sell, that come off the market, but that's a relatively small fraction of overall supply. But we saw more than 60% of the available homes, between Hanks and Banks, let's call it Friday, March 13th, come off the market because those sellers felt as though they were sitting ducks staying on the market, where I don't know that that's necessarily true, because we're seeing people online inquiring on our available listings. We currently have about 31 active listings on the
Yeah.
market team, and we're seeing inquiries online actually pick up, particularly over the course of the last week. And it's interesting because there's
I've been hearing that same feedback around the country, that
yeah,
there is an uptick because you literally have a captive audience.
yeah, you have a
And
captive audience, and you also have stabilization as far as volatility in the equity markets, right? So
yes,
people want to know that there's certainty as far as their 401k is concerned, and know that they're not going to be on the proverbial breadline. I know that there are some absurd number of unemployed. What is it, 22 million or something?
yeah, 23, I believe.
It's very high.
Yeah.
But my point is that are those people who are still actively employed looking for homes going to be enough to offset the supply of the 60+% people that came off the market that will come back on as soon as somebody hits the light switch, let's call it May 15th, according to Governor Cuomo, as well as those people who are planning to come on the market. And then you have this new segment of supply. And the new segment of supply consists of those homeowners who were toying with the idea of selling, whether it's needing more space, upgrading, downgrading, thinking about moving to the suburbs, which is a whole other story.
Yeah.
And those are going to come on the market and call it, June 1st, May 15th
Sure.
to June 15th. Do you think that, the demand is going to be enough to offset that supply?
So I think, so the answer is no for me. What I think is that I don't think we're going to have runaway price growth, or, that demand will overpower supply. I think that, when you have a Fed governor saying we have a potential of 30% unemployment, Treasury Secretary saying 20%, say it's far less than that, whatever it is, that will impact demand more than it will impact supply. And so I do think that you're going to have some price compression even after there's that sort of, it's open season that we can go look. But I think that it would be far less than what you would see if you had to sell your home right now. In other words, there'll be so much activity that I think price pressure, I think, would be more muted, but still negative.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, just sort of as an aside, and then we have all kinds of other calculus to do, because I do think that at least for the next couple of years, the urban versus suburban, I think suburban has a little bit of an edge. I think the second home market is in good. It is interestingly, there's upside to that, because just of what we saw in the January and February, people trying to rent houses in the suburbs. We saw this in Miami and a bunch of markets in Florida too, before they could see things getting worse, and they just wanted to be out of the city temporarily. The one thing I'll just add on top of all this, and I may be wrong, but I don't think so, that human beings have an incredible capacity to forget the recent past. And we learned this with 9/11 and Lehman. Not that we forget, but that, I just think back to when the financial crisis hit, and the proclamation across, the TV spectrum from prognosticators was, we're going to become a nation of renters. Because you're standing in the middle of a foreclosure crisis, right?
Right.
So I think it's really too early to call these sort of structural changes in housing demand, but there will be changes. I mean, look at us now, having a virtual discussion with a bunch of people. I think that's, there's going to be a lot of changes, but that's not one. I'm not saying it won't happen, but I'm skeptical, at least at this time.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I'm going to open it up to any questions, and I'm going to ask someone from my team just to shoot me the questions. Can you copy and paste questions here from live feed? So when we open up in, say, June, what do you think the temperament of sellers will be? Because they have these expectations that are understandably at a certain level,
Yeah,
because they may have been considering coming on the market in, say, June or February to time it with what we call bonus season, which is when people in finance in the city, which I don't know about everyone else, but about 70% of our customers are employed in one shape or another in finance. And
sure.
so we try to time our listings for when those people are getting their bonuses, because we find that the activity in the market is most robust at that point.
Right.
They're either planning for the bonus that they're going to get, or they've gotten the bonus, so now they have greater certainty and their affordability. And so sellers
Well,
obviously.
it's an important segment because the securities industry in New York accounts for about 23% of the wages, and only 5% of the jobs. And every securities job that, this is our sort of, our baby in terms of our engine for the city's economy. Every private sector, every securities job accounts for 2.5 additional private sector jobs. So it's very important. And how they do, I think, is also very important to the outlook for the housing market.
Right. And so with that said, sellers knowing that they could have gotten, a certain price, say February 1st, based on market data, and now they're faced with the reality of June 1st. How do we manage those sellers
Sure.
in such a way that, they're more realistic in what they can get?
Well, you have, you have a shift in the market, with this crisis, with an added layer of uncertainty, that we're on a daily basis, we sort of figure out how the future looks, or we get a little piece of the picture. So, in my sort of appraisal world, what I've seen over my 33 years is this, it takes an average of 1 to 2 years for sellers to capitulate to a sudden change in market conditions without feeling like they left money on the table.
Wow. Did
And
you
then
say
you have
1 to 2
buyers.
years?
What's that?
Did you say 1 to 2 years?
1 to 2 years, exactly, right. But and not have that feeling like they're losing, they're selling too low. But at the same time, buyers are in like the second they smell blood, that there's some weakness. So I think what happens initially is buyers go into low, sellers hold on, and you don't have this explosion of sales immediately. But I do think that both parties will quickly learn that conditions, are, that they have to absorb and think about what has happened. This everything that a real estate agent, the focus on is that they have to de-anchor. The seller has to de-anchor from pre-COVID as a benchmark. Like I always, one of my favorite saying is the market doesn't care what you think. When we talk about what a seller wants for their property, well, the virus doesn't care what you think either. Like it's no different. And so they need to be educated on what the position, how the market changed, and the data over the next several weeks is where it's going to start flowing in, and we will see sort of post-COVID transactions in full. Right now, we're really not seeing that. We're seeing deals that maybe were slow to move that are coming in, and contracts are being signed now, which is a tell that the market will move forward, because even armed with the knowledge of what's happened, and maybe there's a renegotiation on some of the cases in price, they're still willing to go forward. And I think that's an important sign.
Yeah. Now, what do you think will happen as far as the suburban home market is concerned? Let's say, I know you're in Connecticut right now.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, you're in Connecticut. I'm in New Jersey.
To be specific, I'm 15 feet away from my refrigerator. If that helps, like you geolocate where I'm living. So go ahead.
Absolutely. So I'm in a basement in my house in New Jersey. You're in Connecticut. I know other people who are, thinking about doing the same thing, because these people who went from a really nice 2,000 square foot 3 bedroom with their wife and 2 children are now thinking, what am I doing? And so
Right.
do you think that, there's going to be increased demand for, more, let's say,
More square footage.
more square footage within a commutable distance of New York City? What do you think happens to those markets, which historically over the last couple of years have been a little sleepy, particularly Connecticut?
Yeah. So the way I think of it is, at least for the next couple of, next few years, is that there will be, a jump in interest in buying, especially from the rental market, first time buyers, and then just people that are looking for more space. I mean, you think about it right now, you have, millions of people living with their significant others and children,
Yep.
realizing, well, you know, I don't know. I thought 2,000 square feet was enough, but maybe
One would think,
not
right?
enough, right? And so, you see purchase decisions based on that. So I think there's benefit to the suburbs over the urban markets, but I think it's really easy to overstate it and say, boy, everybody from the city is just going to run out and buy a home in the suburbs. I think the starter markets in the suburbs and the middle markets, which have been doing very well for the last few years, the upper third of the market is what's been soft. I'm not so sure. I think this will help the upper third of sort of the luxury suburban markets, but it won't make them as vibrant as the starter and the middle markets. I think a lot of the higher end consumer is going to end up staying in the city, but maybe buying a second home that they didn't have. And wherever that is, it doesn't matter, but whatever, it's outside of the city, so they have two options.
So
And
you think the second home market is likely to see greater activity than people sort of, doing this suburban migration in its entirety and calling places like, let's say Greenwich or Bedford, Rye, Short Hills, places like
right.
that, their primary. They're gonna maintain a primary in the city, but their renewed focus is going to be on finding a second home.
Yeah, so yes, sort of. I mean, what I'm not saying is that the demand for housing in the suburbs will be overtaken by demand for second home. But what I'm saying is that it'll play a larger role
Right.
than it did before the virus, at least for the next few years. Remember, I'm looking at this as a temporary adjustment rather than a permanent structural change.
Sure.
But I'm not saying it couldn't be permanent. I'm just saying that just from past experience, we've seen other movements to the suburbs, like after 9/11,
Right.
that ended up reversing. So we just don't know.
Yeah, I know that in the wake of September 11th, many people felt like, the sheen of the city was no longer what it was.
Right.
And that quickly faded. Of course, we saw that pent up demand we were talking about earlier. We saw that show up in the first quarter of 2002. With open houses packed and many properties going over the asking price. Of course, we're already sort of on the precipice of a recession. Don't forget, when we experienced September 11th and the attacks of 2001, we were still in the wake of the .com crash, which many people
Right.
seem to forget. But that was March of 2000. So you fast forward, about 16 months later, and you have the attacks of September 11th pushing us off of the.
And we were actually right in that period. We were already in a recession, but didn't know it. And
Right.
So when the Fed cut rates right after the attacks, there was this explosion of demand shortly after 9/11. I saw 5 weeks after 9/11, a 5-way bidding war in the East 50s in Manhattan of a non-doorman, 1-bedroom apartment, and that's when I went, wow,
Yeah.
but that was because rates fell so sharply.
Yeah.
Where we are here, rates are already at zero, and actually 30-year, while mortgage rates are very, flirting with records, mortgage rates, at least as of the other day, last time I looked, I think was Tuesday, so I'm a little bit behind. But mortgage rates are actually a little bit higher than they were at the end of February,
Yeah,
even
that's
with
right.
1.5% federal funds rate cut.
That's right.
So but still that's incredibly low. But banks aren't, willing to go down that much lower because of their concern about liquidity, right?
Right.
Layoffs and all that. Can you make your mortgage payment even if the
Right.
rate?
We're also seeing underwriting. We're seeing underwriting guidelines tighten.
Absolutely.
And there are a lot of banks that are no longer offering jumbo loans. Of course, JP
Yes.
Morgan Chase just came out the other day and said, if you want a loan with us, you've got to put 20% down.
Right.
So underwriting guidelines are changing quite
Yeah,
a bit.
LTVs, aren't as generous, and credit scores are inching higher in terms of what they're looking at. There's less exceptions being made. And, we can criticize the banks for that in our time of need. But if you think about it, banks are actually now doing what they should be doing in terms of risk management, self-preservation, versus what was on in the financial crisis, where it was all about bailing out the banks. Here, the banks are sort of being looked to help us out with, like, the SBA loans and things like that. So it's quite a change.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, this has been great. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your
Oh, my
busy
pleasure.
schedule. I know you're in demand these days because people want to know the information that there is. And, I am a believer like you are in just delivering the facts, and the rest will sort of work itself out. So,
Exactly.
a lot of times in our business, brokers will sort of overinflate things to get listings. And I'm a believer in just saying, look, this is what the data supports. And so here you are, the king of data. So I really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us. Jonathan Miller, everybody of Miller Samuel in New York, the Dean of Appraisers.